Most people remember Aniello Dellacroce as John Gotti's mentor, the man who stood behind him and shaped his rise. What is often overlooked is that Neil himself had a story just as deep and just as revealing. He was not simply an advisor operating in the background. He was the second most powerful figure in the Gambino crime family, a man whose authority was recognized far beyond his own organization. Among other mobsters, Dellacroce carried the reputation of a true gangster, someone whose word carried weight and whose presence demanded respect. To understand John Gotti, it is necessary to understand the man who stood beside him for decades. Aniello Dellacroce was born in 1914 in New York City to Italian immigrants from Sicily. Even as a child, he stood out. He did not resemble the stereotypical image associated with Italian gangsters of the era. Neil had unusually light blue eyes, a detail that many later remembered as unsettling. His family lived in Little Italy at 232 Mulberry Street, directly across from the famous Alto Nights social club. That location mattered. The club was frequented by some of the most powerful figures in organized crime, including men like Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. As a boy, Neil often looked out the window and watched these men come and go. At the time, he had no way of knowing that years later, he would not only move within the same world, but that the club itself would eventually belong to him. Little Italy in those years offered few legitimate paths forward. Overcrowding, poverty, and limited opportunities shaped daily life. Like many young men in the neighborhood, Neil took what work he could find. After school, he worked as a butcher's assistant, learning discipline and routine, but the streets exerted a stronger pull. At the age of 16, Neil received his first prison sentence. He was convicted of grand larceny and sentenced to 2.5 years in a penal colony. It was during this period that he adopted the name Neil, a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. Prison did not reform him, it hardened him. When he returned to the streets, he began building a reputation that would define him for decades. In 1937, he was arrested again. This time, he pleaded guilty to assault and received a 6-month sentence. By the end of the 1930s, his name was already circulating within organized crime circles. His behavior, loyalty, and willingness to use violence brought him to the attention of the Mangano crime family. Led at the time by Vincent Mangano, Dellacroce was offered a place within the family, marking the formal beginning of his rise. Neil Dellacroce is often linked to Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm used by various Mafia families. These services were frequently employed by Mangano's underboss, Albert Anastasia. There is no definitive proof that Dellacroce was an official member of that group, but his reputation did not require confirmation. He was widely known as a brutal and efficient killer. Stories circulated that he preferred to look directly into his victim's eyes before delivering the final blow, as if to fully absorb the moment life faded away. New York detective Ralph Salerno later summed up that reputation with chilling clarity. He stated that of all the criminals he personally encountered, only 2 truly frightened him: Carmine Galante and Neil Dellacroce. According to Salerno, they shared something unmistakable: the eyes of murderers. In 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared without a trace. His body was never found. The prevailing belief was that Albert Anastasia ordered his elimination to seize control of the family. After Mangano's disappearance, the organization became known as the Anastasia family. In the reshuffling of power that followed, Neil Dellacroce was promoted to the rank of captain. Not long after, Dellacroce formed a close alliance with another captain, Armand Rava, and aligned himself with his faction in the early 1950s. Around this same period, another encounter would quietly shape the future. Dellacroce met a young, aggressive burglar named John Gotti. At the time, Gotti was involved in airport thefts and operated under Carmine Fatico, another captain within the Anastasia family. Their paths crossed early, long before either man understood how closely their fates would be tied. During the 1950s, Dellacroce married Mary Riccardi. A year later, they had a son, Armando Dellacroce, named after Armand Rava. Armando would later follow in his father's footsteps and enter organized crime. Neil was not the only member of his family involved in the underworld. His older brother Carmine, along with nephews Angelo and Salvatore Ruggetto, were also part of the Gambino family's extended network. One event from this period would define Dellacroce's daily life for decades. In 1956, he purchased a property directly across from his parents' home, and opened the Ravenite Social Club. What began as a neighborhood meeting place quickly became far more than that. The Ravenite would serve as Dellacroce's headquarters for the rest of his career, a fixed point in a life otherwise built on secrecy, loyalty, and violence. Dellacroce chose the name of his club deliberately. He borrowed it from one of his favorite Edgar Allan Poe poems, a small but revealing detail about how he viewed image, symbolism, and control. The Ravenite Social Club was not meant to look like an ordinary hangout. Men who entered were expected to wear suits. Drinking inside the club was forbidden. The rules were strict, and they were enforced. The atmosphere was formal, disciplined, and intentionally intimidating. The club was not about leisure, it was about authority. That authority was tested almost immediately. In August of 1956, Dellacroce and two of his associates were arrested during a police raid on the Ravenite. Officially, the charges were vagrancy, despite the fact that Dellacroce was carrying far more than the legally required $2 in his pocket. After the search, additional charges were added: criminal conspiracy with known local troublemakers and possession of an illegal weapon, a 12-inch blackjack. Dellacroce was released shortly afterward on $500 bail. The arrest was not random. It was connected to a much larger investigation. Earlier that year, in April 1956, journalist Victor Riesel had acid thrown into his face, leaving him permanently blind. Riesel had been aggressively exposing corruption within labor unions, making him a target. The man who carried out the attack was later shot and killed by police on Mulberry Street, just 1 block from the Ravenite. In the aftermath, officers were ordered to detain and question anyone considered suspicious in the area. Dellacroce was swept up in that response. But the pressure was not limited to his personal affairs. The entire Mafia landscape was shifting. On October 25, 1957, a defining event shook the underworld. Albert Anastasia was assassinated while sitting in a barber's chair. 3 gunmen entered the shop and opened fire as Anastasia lay back with a hot towel covering his face. The killing was precise, symbolic, and final. With Anastasia gone, the balance of power changed overnight. Carlo Gambino emerged as the new boss. The reasons and maneuvering behind that transition are complex and contested, but the result was clear. Not everyone accepted it quietly. Armand Rava, Dellacroce's close ally, was openly dissatisfied with Gambino's rise. Dellacroce faced a choice. He chose survival over loyalty. He did not back his friend. Instead, he swore allegiance to Carlo Gambino. Gambino moved quickly to eliminate dissent. In 1958, Armand Rava disappeared in Florida. His body was never recovered. Multiple theories circulated, but the prevailing belief was that Gambino ordered his murder and assigned Salvatore Toto Arello to carry it out. After Rava's disappearance, Gambino summoned Dellacroce. The two men met, negotiated, and reached an understanding. With that agreement, internal conflict within the family ended. From that point forward, Dellacroce's power grew steadily. He became known as the Captain of Captains, a figure whose authority extended even over other high-ranking members. Around this time, he also acquired several nicknames. One of them was O'Neill. The name came from an incident in which Dellacroce disguised himself as a Catholic priest, introduced himself as Reverend Timothy O'Neill, and used the disguise to gain access to a location where his intended target was present. He was also sometimes called the Pole, a reference to his non-Italian appearance. It was not a name anyone dared to use in his presence. By then, fear surrounded him as much as respect. During these same years, law enforcement intensified its efforts against organized crime, including the Gambino family. One of the preferred methods was financial pressure. Tax violations had proven effective. To deflect suspicion from the Internal Revenue Service, Dellacroce was officially listed as an employee of the Royal Crown Bottling Company in Newark, New Jersey. The company's president, Martin Goldman, was a close associate. Goldman helped Dellacroce and several other mob figures secure fake jobs, providing them with a paper trail of legitimate income. For a time, the arrangement worked. Eventually, it attracted attention. Goldman was arrested and charged with extortion and money laundering on behalf of the Mafia. Dellacroce was called to testify in court, took the stand and invoked the Fifth Amendment 18 times. He answered nothing. The silence was complete, and it sent its own message. Aniello Dellacroce's legal troubles did little to slow his rise inside the Mafia. If anything, they reinforced his reputation. By 1965, his ascent reached a decisive stage. Carlo Gambino removed the aging Joseph Biondo from the position of underboss and soon elevated Dellacroce to replace him. The promotion was widely noted, not only within the underworld, but also by journalists, who now described Dellacroce as the second most powerful mobster in the United States, surpassed only by Gambino himself. Along with the title came expanded control. After Albert Anastasia's death, Dellacroce took over the Brooklyn docks, pushing aside Anastasia's brother, Anthony. Control of the waterfront was critical. It meant influence over shipping, unions, and labor contracts. Dellacroce became a central figure within the truck drivers' unions, further strengthening his leverage. By this point, his authority extended far beyond street crews. He was now deeply embedded in the infrastructure that kept organized crime profitable and protected. His standing was further confirmed the following year. On September 22, 1966, a secret meeting of the Mafia's senior leadership took place at the La Stella restaurant in Queens. Dellacroce attended alongside 12 other high-ranking figures from the East Coast and beyond. Among them were Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, Santo Trafficante of Tampa, and Carlos Marcello of New Orleans. The presence of these men alone marked the meeting as significant. Law enforcement learned of the gathering through informants and moved quickly. Police arrived at the restaurant and arrested all 13 participants, charging them with criminal conspiracy. The press immediately labeled the event the Little Appalachian, drawing comparisons to the infamous 1957 Appalachian meeting, where more than 60 top mobsters had been rounded up by police. As with that earlier gathering, authorities never fully established the purpose of the meeting at La Stella. One theory suggested it was convened to discuss succession plans for Tommy Lucchese, who was terminally ill at the time. Whatever the true reason, the importance of the meeting was undeniable. When called before a grand jury, Dellacroce and the others refused to testify. No serious charges stuck initially, but their silence would not be forgotten. Years later, the consequences arrived. In September 1971, Dellacroce was subpoenaed again, this time before a Manhattan grand jury investigating a mob-controlled casino operation in the Dominican Republic. Once more, he refused to answer questions. The court responded by sentencing him to 1 year in prison for contempt. After serving the term, Dellacroce returned directly to the Ravenite, resuming his role as if nothing had changed. Violence against him remained rare. One notable exception occurred on August 1, 1972. An armed gangster named Carlo Lombardi entered the Ravenite and fired 4 shots at Dellacroce's brother and bodyguard, Carmine. Lombardi was quickly disarmed and beaten but managed to escape. A week later, he returned, this time carrying an assault rifle. He attempted to kill Dellacroce himself. The weapon jammed. Lombardi fled once again. That was his final mistake. The following week, Dellacroce's men located Lombardi and shot him inside his own car. 2 months later, Lombardi's associate, Joseph Fume, was also killed. The message was clear. Attempts on Dellacroce's life would not be tolerated, and they would not go unanswered. Still, these incidents were exceptions. In general, Dellacroce ruled through fear and respect rather than constant violence. His authority was absolute. Orders given in his name were obeyed without hesitation. Within his territory, particularly Manhattan, his word carried finality. Among those who knew him, he earned another nickname, a man's man. It reflected how he was seen: cold, disciplined, unyielding, and impossible to intimidate. By this stage, Aniello Dellacroce had become exactly what the Mafia valued most: stability backed by force, loyalty enforced by reputation, and power that did not need to announce itself. It was only natural that as Carlo Gambino's health declined in the early 1970s, real control of the family shifted to Aniello Dellacroce. As underboss, he assumed responsibility for day-to-day operations, and his authority was not questioned. Orders issued through Dellacroce carried the same weight as if they had come directly from Gambino himself. Within the organization, discipline tightened, and everyone understood who was actually running things. Dellacroce's influence extended beyond the Mafia. Among the Italian residents of Mulberry Street, He was a familiar and respected figure. He had been born there, raised there, and never truly left. To many locals, he functioned as an unofficial godfather of the neighborhood. He helped people find jobs, settle disputes, and solve problems they could not take to the authorities. His door was always open. In return, the residents protected him. They watched the streets, noticed unfamiliar faces, reported strange questions, new tenants, and unknown cars parked too long in the area. This informal security network operated quietly for decades. It created an environment where law enforcement struggled to move unnoticed. FBI agents and police investigators found themselves exposed the moment they entered the neighborhood. Information traveled faster than surveillance. For a long time, it worked. Eventually, it was not enough. In 1972, Dellacroce was indicted again, this time on tax charges. Prosecutors accused him of failing to report more than $100,000 in stock tied to Yankee Plastics, a company he was also extorting. Despite legal maneuvering and delays, the case moved forward. In June 1973, Dellacroce was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison in Atlanta. Prison did not break his control. Thanks to long-established connections, he enjoyed special treatment. Privileges other inmates did not. He even had a personal cook. More importantly, he continued to run business from behind bars. Orders were relayed, decisions were enforced. His position inside the family remained intact. After serving 3 years of his sentence in Atlanta, Dellacroce was transferred to Rikers Island to serve an additional 6 months for contempt related to jury duty. The move brought him closer to New York, closer to his base. Even then, his influence did not weaken. By 1974, the Gambino family was at the height of its power. Its operations generated enormous profits through a tightly organized system that covered labor unions, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and racketeering. Under the de facto leadership of Dellacroce, even while he was incarcerated, the family stood as one of the strongest criminal organizations in the country, with dozens of captains and hundreds of soldiers operating under its banner. One of those captains was loan shark Antonio "Tony" Plate. He had started in the Bronx, later moved to Miami, and placed Charlie Calais in charge of local operations, collecting a monthly share from him. Over time, tensions developed. Plate suspected Calais was cooperating with the FBI. After consulting with Dellacroce, he received authorization to act. On July 7, 1974, Calais's body was discovered riddled with bullets. 5 shots to the head, 2 through the eyes, 2 through the ears, and 1 through the mouth. The message was unmistakable. See too much, hear too much, talk too much. Later, sources would confirm that Calais had indeed been an FBI informant. At that moment, Dellacroce was nearing the end of his sentence. Soon he would no longer need intermediaries to deal with informants. He would be back in position to issue orders directly. While he waited for his release, Carlo Gambino made a decision that would reshape the future of the family. He named his successor. Many assumed the choice would be Dellacroce. The assumption seemed logical. Instead, Gambino selected Paul Castellano. The announcement stunned much of the organization. Castellano was known as a businessman, focused on white-collar schemes and corporate rackets. Dellacroce was a street-level enforcer, respected by crews who valued traditional mafia authority. The decision created unease. Loyalty remained, but resentment began to form. And beneath the surface, the balance of power quietly shifted. Dellacroce accepted Carlo Gambino's decision without public resistance. He remained underboss, and Joseph Nicholas Gallo was appointed consigliere of the family. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died peacefully in his bed. With his death, leadership officially passed to Paul Castellano. By that time, Dellacroce had finally been released from Rikers Island on medical grounds. His health had deteriorated, and he required surgery to remove his gallbladder. After the operation, Dellacroce returned to the Ravenite and resumed his duties as underboss. Castellano, at least outwardly, acknowledged Dellacroce's long service, influence, and authority. Publicly, there was respect. Internally, the family was split, 2 factions solidified. One loyal to Castellano and his business-first approach. The other loyal to Dellacroce, whose authority came from the streets and whose loyalty was earned through decades of shared risk. That division never disappeared. In 1979, authorities made another attempt to put Dellacroce away. After nearly 5 years of investigation, law enforcement arrested Dellacroce and Tony Plate on charges of conspiring to murder Charlie Calais. The case rested almost entirely on the testimony of mobster James "Jimmy" Fela, who had become an FBI informant. Fela claimed that in 1974 he had visited Plate to discuss business. And during that meeting, Plate openly discussed Calais's murder. According to Fela, Dellacroce later grew concerned that Plate might cooperate with authorities. The case had a fatal weakness. Plate was the only link tying Dellacroce to the alleged conspiracy. If Plate disappeared, the entire prosecution collapsed. In May 1979, Tony Plate went out with an acquaintance and never returned. Neither the two men nor the car they were driving were ever found. With Plate gone, the case against Dellacroce disintegrated. He was acquitted of all charges. Inside the Gambino family, dissatisfaction continued to grow. More members became openly resentful of Castellano's leadership. They viewed him as greedy, detached, and dismissive of the street-level crews who generated the family's income. Castellano ruled from a mansion. Dellacroce ruled from Mulberry Street. That contrast mattered. At the same time, New York law enforcement intensified its focus on Dellacroce. By then, he had been brought to trial 15 times and had almost always walked free. Over more than 50 years of criminal activity, he had served only 6 years in prison. Police and federal agencies were determined to change that. The operation targeting him was codenamed Acorn. It was ambitious, but repeatedly delayed. Surveillance proved difficult. The FBI tried to rent apartments near the Ravenite, but residents of Mulberry Street refused to cooperate. The neighborhood closed ranks as it always had. Eventually, agents found a workaround. They rented an apartment directly across the street, leased under the name of a Chinese tenant who attracted less suspicion. Even then, obstacles remained. Dellacroce's watchdog, a sheepdog named Duke, made installing listening devices inside the club nearly impossible. Agents resorted to feeding the dog sausages laced with tranquilizers. They managed to place wiretaps, but the victory was short-lived. Ravenite security discovered the bugs almost immediately and removed them. On another occasion, guards noticed detectives hiding in the trunks of cars parked near the club. Dellacroce responded without hesitation. He ordered fire hydrants opened and directed water at the vehicles until the officers were forced to reveal themselves. The message was unmistakable. Surveillance would not go unnoticed. In 1981, persistence finally paid off. FBI agents successfully tapped the phone of Aniello Ruggiero. Ruggiero believed the line was safe because the house was registered in his daughter's name. That assumption proved costly. For years, agents listened in as members of the Gambino family spoke freely about loan sharking, drug trafficking, and internal disputes. For the first time, law enforcement had what it had been chasing for decades. Direct voices, direct evidence, a clear window into a world that had long operated just beyond reach. By 1983, Aniello Ruggiero had said enough on the wire to justify his arrest. Along with him, John Gotti's brother, Gene Gotti, was also brought to trial. The material gathered from the taps at Ruggiero's house proved even more valuable than investigators initially expected. Those recordings gave federal authorities the leverage they needed to take the next step. Permission was granted to install a wiretap inside the home of Paul Castellano himself. At that point, Aniello Dellacroce was already gravely ill. Cancer had weakened him significantly, yet he remained accessible to members of the Gambino family and continued involving himself in daily matters as much as his condition allowed. Even in decline, his presence still mattered. His words still carried weight. By 1984, the government had assembled an extensive body of evidence against all 5 New York Mafia families. In November of that year, Dellacroce was indicted on charges of income tax evasion. The pressure intensified. In February 1985, Dellacroce, Paul Castellano, and numerous other figures were charged with racketeering in what would become known as the Mafia Commission trial, a case designed to strike at the leadership structure of organized crime as a whole. In March, Dellacroce, his son, Aniello Ruggiero, and 7 other Gambino family members were formally charged with racketeering. None of them entered guilty pleas. Castellano alone faced 78 separate counts. The stakes could not have been higher. By June 1985, Ruggiero managed to gain access to the FBI wiretap recordings. Castellano immediately demanded that the tapes be turned over to him. What he did not know was that those recordings captured John Gotti, Ruggiero, and others openly insulting the boss and discussing drug trafficking, an activity Castellano officially forbade. Had Castellano heard those tapes, the consequences would have been immediate and lethal. Dellacroce stepped in as an intermediary. He delayed the handover as long as possible, shielding his people while trying to prevent an internal catastrophe. He told Castellano that the recordings contained deeply personal conversations and that Ruggiero was ashamed to hand them over. It was a fragile balancing act, one Dellacroce had spent his entire life mastering. During this period, John Gotti approached Dellacroce with a suggestion that crossed a line. He proposed killing Castellano. Dellacroce rejected it outright. In a recorded phone call, he explained the rule that still governed his thinking. "You don't understand Cosa Nostra," he told Gotti. "Cosa Nostra means the boss is your boss." It was the voice of the old school, unwavering even as the ground beneath it shifted. By December 1985, the situation had become overwhelming. Dellacroce was facing additional charges, including drug trafficking and criminal conspiracy. His son had pleaded guilty, and combined, the potential sentence approached 20 years. Angelo Ruggiero managed to flee before sentencing. Dellacroce himself no longer had the strength to fight. On December 2, 1985, Aniello Dellacroce died at the Immaculate Virgin Mary Hospital in Queens. He was 71 years old. True to habit, even in death he maintained discretion. The hospital room was registered under the name Timothy O'Neill. Paul Castellano, out on bail at the time, did not attend Dellacroce's funeral. Without Dellacroce's restraint and guidance, events moved quickly. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano had already set their plan in motion. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and his driver were shot and killed outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. 2 weeks later, John Gotti became the boss of the Gambino family. Aniello Dellacroce never held the top title. He never sought public recognition, yet his influence shaped the family for decades. He embodied the values of the old-school mafia: loyalty to structure, respect for hierarchy, silence, discipline. In the end, when those values disappeared, so did the balance he had spent a lifetime preserving. This was the story of Aniello Dellacroce, a man whose name never became a brand, but whose presence defined an era.